All right. You were 5 years old when you got your first pigeon?
Yes.
Was it a racing homer?
Well, it was, yeah. I lived on a ranch up in Denton. We had an old barn, and there was pigeons on the barn. And I got to watch them. I was always fascinated to see them fly. I saw one of them had a band on his leg. Get out, Tex. So I talked my uncle into helping me go down there at night, get up in the barn with a flashlight, and we found that bird with a band on him and caught him off a rafter. And I was fascinated with him. But nobody knew what the band was. None of my people or family knew what the band was for. But there was a guy in Denton that raised pigeons. So my father called him and asked him, talked to him. And he was the guy that had racing pigeons. And he told us what the bird was. And it was a racing homer, and told me about Get Out, Texas. That's the first time I ever heard of racing pigeons. And I was 5 years old at that time. And then we moved to town shortly after that, and I started school in the next year in Garland, and I didn't have a pigeon that year. The next year, a boy in my class trapped a common pigeon. We lived in town then, and he had a gin down there close to him. He trapped a common pigeon, and I had to have that common pigeon, so I built a crystal radio, and I traded him my crystal radio for that common pigeon. And I named him Homer. He was a dark white flight pigeon, and that was a common pigeon then. And then I saw in a racing pigeon bulletin in the school that there was a guy selling pigeons and getting out of the pigeon business in New Jersey, and his name was Millard Freeman, and he was going to the service. So anyway, I wrote him, and he gave me a pair of pigeons if I would pay the freight. So I picked up Coke bottles and sold Coke bottles, and we get 2 cents a bottle, I think, or something. I don't know.
You were 6?
Huh?
You were 6 when this happened?
Between 6 or 7, then started on there. But we had a ball field right close to our house, and I go down and pick up bottles. Well, I must have been older than 6 by then. This may have been a year or two later than that, but I was still in grade school, and picked up those Coke bottles and sold them, and got enough money to pay the freight. And he sent me a pair of pigeons, and that's how I got started in pigeons. And I've never been. The only time I was ever without them was after that was the 4 years I went to college, and I would go on the weekends to the local guys that had pigeons around there and watch their races on the weekend when I come in from college. And then as soon as I graduated from college, I started flying. And I graduated from college in '63, and I got first pigeons in '65. My first race, I raced when I was in junior high with a local club. I didn't have the money to buy a clock. Then our clocks were little 2-bird timers, and I didn't have the money for a clock, so they wouldn't let me race, but they'd let me ship my birds with them, and then I'd get my bird home and ride my bicycle down to where they were having the clubhouse and show them I got a bird. And then, but then in '65 I got racing pigeons again, and flew my first race in 1966, and I flew. Then I was flying with the Daltex Club. There were Daltex Club, the Dallas Homing, Dallas Limited, and one other club, a Garland Club. And the only one that let me fly with them was the Daltex Club because I lived too far outside their boundaries. I lived outside Dallas County. So I flew with Daltex Club, and they would let me fly. And I flew 4.5 years before I ever won a pigeon race.
4.5 years.
I flew 4.5 years before I won a pigeon race. And that getting discouraged was not in the equation. I mean, they didn't give you anything. Back then, they had so many pigeon flyers. The Daltex Club at that time had like 55 or 60 members, and about 40 to 50 of them were shipping. And we'd fly anywhere 40 to 50 shippers. And back then, people didn't tell you anything because they didn't need you to fly. Now, we all are a brotherhood that try to help each other because we have to be able to fly. Back then, they had plenty of money. I mean, there was enough of them, and hauling didn't cost that much. They didn't care if you flew or not. I mean, you know, they'd help you, they'd give you some pigeons. but they wouldn't tell you anything.
No secrets told.
They wouldn't tell you anything. And I can't tell you how many years it took for us to learn little things. And I had a friend who, after I got out of high school, he was still in school. His name was Rick Martis, and he had that CBS Continental Breeding Station. But Rick and I were friends, and we realized that those guys that weren't tell us anything, or if they told you something, you couldn't be sure it was true, because they'd tell you stuff to mislead you. But we realized that the only way we were going to learn anything about pigeons was to go somewhere else. And if you went out of town and they knew you weren't a threat to them, they'd tell you something. So we drove. He and I drove. We were just teenagers. We drove from Garland to Shreveport. We drove to Pampa, Texas. We went everywhere. Anywhere that we'd get somebody that would talk to us about racing pigeons, we'd go see them and ask them. And they started telling us things that we learned then. And then, anyway, from then on, I flew 4.5 years in Dallas before I finally won a pigeon race. And the Dallas Texas Club let me win the first place in that club, but we were flying the Dallas Combine, and they wouldn't give me the prize, the trophy. A guy named Nick Segota was second, and Nick Segota got the trophy. And he tried to tell him that wasn't right. Nick said, that's not right, he beat me. But anyway, they gave the trophy to Nick. But I was not upset about it. I was disappointed, but I was not upset about it, because that was the rules when I joined the club. They told me right straight up front. And I had no ill feelings about it at all. But then later, I won my first pigeon race in 1970, I think, or 71. And then in 1972, I moved to Weatherford. I moved my loft from Wiley to Weatherford, and flew in the Weatherford Club for a while, small club, and then they let us start shipping with the Fort Worth Club because gas prices were getting high and we couldn't afford to ship by ourselves. So they let us ship with the Fort Worth Club. We paid shipping fees, but they wouldn't let us have the trophies.
And what year was this?
That was in 1970, about 1972 or 3, we joined the Fort Worth Club.
What was higher gas prices then?
At that time was probably like $2 or $3 a gallon, $2 maybe.
That is high for back then.
I'm not sure. Later in 77 is when the gas prices really went high. But anyway, we flew with the Fort Worth Club, and we had our little Weatherford Club, and we won our trophies, but we couldn't win the Fort Worth Club trophies. And then finally, they began to realize we were working when we went to shipping that, and you had a lot of flyers, and a lot of guys would just bring their birds up and sit down and go off, and the same 5 or 6 guys would do all the shipping and the figuring, and the other guys sit over and talk. They were always having trouble getting somebody to help shipping and do the work. And then they began to have problems with the race secretary. He was the only one then we figured everything by hand. Everything was figured by hand, and it was a pretty good job. And they had a system set up to do it. But to figure the variations, they had a slide rule to figure the clock variation. Then we used manual clocks, and they wind them up. And if your clock, when we started the clocks at the same time on the international time zone, and then when you clocked birds, you had to call in, and within an hour of the time you got a bird, and report the exact time you got the bird. Then they would determine when they would figure the race. And when they got a certain percentage of the birds in, they'd say, okay, we're going to call the clocking or figuring the race at 5 o'clock this afternoon. And you had to be there at 5 o'clock. And they kicked them at 5 o'clock exactly. And then they figured the variation in the clock. And if your clock had gained so many seconds, they added it, they took it off of it. They took it off of it. If it was slow so many seconds, they added a certain percentage of that time to it. But anyway, they had a slide rule system. Then we didn't have calculators. They had a twisting, kind of a slide rule deal to figure the variation. And the race secretary was he was very independent. He was the only one that could figure the race. So he kind of told them what to do, and they got tired of it. And anyway, I told them I could figure that race. I could figure the variations for them. So anyway, they decided to let us join the club.
No, mine won't come to
No,
one.
we got it fine. They decided that maybe they'd let us join the club to be members if we were gonna help figure the race. So then we became members of the Fort Worth Racing Club. And I raced with them until in the Fort Worth Club, we joined the North Texas Concourse was formed during that time. And we had some races, a few races, we had 1,000 pigeons in the race, 900, 800, and 100 lofts. And it was really fun and really a competition. And then the North Texas Concourse was all of Dallas, all the clubs in Dallas, and all the clubs in Fort Worth. And there was a little club in Denton at that time. We all flew the concourse and really had good competition. And I flew there until 1978. I flew my last race season in 1978 in Fort Worth. I didn't get to fly the whole Old Bird season, but I flew part of the Old Bird season in 1978, and then I moved my Lofts from Weatherford, the same one I'd moved from Wiley to Weatherford, and twice in Weatherford. I moved it from Weatherford to East Texas. Started flying in the Loft of the Pines Club, was formed in 1978. When I came down here, we got a Butch Nix, had pigeons, and I told him I was moving down here, so they started forming a club. They got the charter in 78, and I flew my first race with them in Old Birds of 78. And that was in 1978. And then I've flown here since 1978.
Haven't missed any years.
Never missed a year. This club, once it was started, and that's been 40-something years ago now, 44 years, we've never failed to fly a race series. We've had a small club, and there was a time or two when only Butch Nix and I flew the 500s. But we coughed up the money, and we either hauled them ourselves or paid to haul them, and we flew the races. And we've flown every race series since 1978 in the Lofts of the Pines Club.
What's the largest membership that the Lofts of the Pines has ever had that actually participated?
I would say I can't remember for sure, it's been so long, but sometimes we had 12 to 15 guys flying. Now, we've always flown a huge landmass area. And from day one, we said in the bylaws of this club that we would fly 4 directions. Every year we changed directions. And when I was in Dallas and Fort Worth, they constantly fought and bickered about directions. We flew every direction except straight up. We flew northeast, northwest, southeast, southwest, south, due south, change of one. There's always somebody that's in a bad loft location. So in the charter of this club, we said that we would fly 4 directions. We wouldn't boundary out anybody that wanted to fly with us. If they were willing to fly to take the effort to get to us, they could fly with us. But every direction we flew a different direction and have done that. And I think that's one of the keys that has kept the club alive. Nobody has ever stuck permanently in a bad loft location. You may never be in the best one. We fly as due east and west and north and south as we can based on the road system. So, and I think that's helped the club.
The best pigeon that you have ever owned that you could say, hey, this was the best bird I ever had?
The best racing pigeon, there's 3 pigeons that come to mind. I can remember individual birds that I can close my eyes and see them to this day, 50 years later. But the best racing pigeon I had was 522. She was a half husky and half sticklebow, and I raced her in concourse, and I lived in Weatherford and flew with the Fort Worth Club. She won a 400-mile concourse race in 1978. And I entered her in the 600. She was 12th on the 600. I was disappointed she didn't win it, but she was 12th. I moved her down here in the fall of 78, I guess. The next year, I loft broke her. The next year, I flew her out of the east. She won the 500 out of the east, and only day bird. The next year after that, we flew south. We turned south. She won the 500 out of the south. There was 2 birds, and she was first.
So you flew in Weatherford and then flew her here?
Yes, I raced her in Weatherford. She won a concourse, 400-mile race.
Wow.
She was a really special pigeon. And then I moved here, loft broker, moved here in the fall, and loft broker in the next spring, we flew east. And I flew her east from 500 miles she wanted. I never got to breed out of her because just as I started breeding out, my brother started racing, and I gave him the best pigeon I owned. I didn't know whether she would breed or not. It turned out that she was a tremendous breeder for him, but I didn't breed out of her. But that was my best racing pigeon. But I have two hens that were the best breeding hens that I've ever owned. One was named Guinevere, and she was part of my old family, mixed up part thing, a lot of Arden, some Husky. And the other was a hen named Kathy, who is a cannibal hen that I got from CBS. Has been a tremendous breeding hen. Those are the two best breeding hens I've ever owned. I've had pigeons that bred me good pigeons, but they bred me lots of good pigeons. Those are the three best pigeons that I ever had. I guess thinking back about good pigeons, I'll never forget my first 500-mile day bird. And like I said, I flew 4.5 years before I won the race, and it wasn't a 500. But it was before I left Wiley, and we were flying a 500-mile race out of the suburbs of Denver, Colorado, which was the northwest course. We were flying northwest one of those deals. And I knew, I don't know why, but I just had confidence that I was going to get daybreak. And I was supposed to go to a church camp on a bus with some people that Saturday. And I said, I can't ride the bus. I'll go, but I can't ride the bus because I got to take my own car because I got to leave early to come home. I'm going to get my first 500-mile daybird. And I drove my car about 100 miles to church camp, left early and came home and got home to see my bird come. And I lived next to a cotton field. And I couldn't, the cotton was high. It was in the spring, cotton was high. And when I sit down on the chair, I couldn't barely see over the top of that cotton. So I got a step ladder, a wooden step ladder, 6-foot ladder, and I set it up and got up on the step ladder where it elevated me about this much. And I could watch across that cotton field. And late that afternoon, I saw him coming across that cotton field. He wasn't that high over the cotton field because it was coming into a real slight headwind. But he was right on top of that cotton coming, and that was my first 500-mile day bird.
That's neat.